Thank you. So we are going to start this morning with our first presidential forum entitled Our Bank at 50. And I have the pleasure to have with me on this panel this morning a very distinguished group of Africans who have played a major role in the long journey that have been the past 50 years for the African Development Bank. So with me this morning, I would want to invite Honorable Alexander Chikwanda, the Minister of Finance, the Republic of Zambia. If he's here, please join us on the panel. Also, Honorable Trevor Manuel, Vice Chair, Rothschild, former Minister of Finance in South Africa. So I saw Honorable Trevor Manuel. Please join us on the stage. Also with us this morning is Mr. Babacar Ndiaye, former President of the African Development Bank. Mr. Ndiaye, if you're here, I saw you. Please join us on the panel. Also with us are Mr. Harold Dole, former Executive Director of the African Development Bank, and Mr. Kiyoshi Kodera, former Executive Director of the African Development Bank from Japan. Please join me on the panel. And to get us started this morning, we're going to be hearing from Sir Dr. Kwame Fodwo, who we call Katinka, to join us on the podium. And Katinka is also a fellow of the Ghana Institute of Arts and Science. So Katinka, please join us on the panel. So also on our panel, we should be having with us Honorable Gracia Machel, founder of the Gracia Machel Trust. I'm not sure she's in the room yet. She may join us any time. And we will also be joined by Her Excellency Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the President of the Republic of Liberia. Thank you very much, everybody. We have our panel now. As you know, the past 50 years have been an extraordinary journey for our bank. And this morning, we would want to share with you a very short film, a documentary indeed, which will actually speak more and give more sense about the progress made by our bank than anybody would do now at this time. Please show us our video.
When the OAU was created and the African Development was created, there were just about 28 independent African countries. What were in the minds of the founding fathers? One was the independence and self-determination of all the peoples of Africa. The second thing was unity in Africa. And the third thing was development.
La Banque africaine de développement célèbre ses 50 ans d'existence, 50 ans au service de l'Afrique. Chaque président a été fidèle aux idéaux de ses pères fondateurs, lutter contre la pauvreté et promouvoir une croissance économique durable sur le continent. La BAD est devenue la première institution de financement du développement en Afrique. De 370 millions de dollars à sa création, son capital atteint aujourd'hui 100 milliards de dollars. La banque obtient une note AAA sur les marchés internationaux. En un demi-siècle, la BAD a su mobiliser et investir plus de 103 milliards de dollars dans les secteurs clés de l'économie des pays membres régionaux. La banque a ainsi aidé à la construction d'infrastructures routières, ferroviaires, maritimes, à la production d'énergie et aux télécommunications. Elle soutient le développement de l'agriculture et de l'industrie. La BAD investit dans le développement du secteur privé africain, accompagne le renforcement des institutions par la promotion de la bonne gouvernance et de l'obligation de rendre compte. Elle participe au développement du capital humain en investissant dans la santé, l'éducation et les technologies. La banque intervient dans tous les pays du continent, quelle que soit leur taille et leurs moyens, et surtout auprès des segments les plus vulnérables de la population. L'institution s'est rendue plus proche de ses clients que sont les gouvernements africains et les populations du continent. Elle a des bureaux dans plus de 30 pays. Dans les années 70, elle introduit à l'intention de ses membres les plus démunis les prêts concessionnels à faible taux d'intérêt assortis de longues durées de remboursement. Dans les années 80, elle ouvre son capital à des pays non africains, élargissant ainsi le cercle de ses membres. Dans les années 90, la banque octroie des prêts au secteur privé africain. Dans les années 2000, elle accentue ses interventions dans les États en situation de fragilité, pendant qu'elle augmente considérablement le volume de ses prêts au lendemain de la crise financière mondiale. Et pour les années 2010, elle se lance dans la promotion d'une croissance non seulement forte, mais partagée et vraiment durable. La banque a la volonté d'intégrer tous les groupes d'âge et toutes les zones géographiques. La BAD place en particulier les femmes au centre de sa vision, non seulement pour la reconnaissance et la défense de leurs droits, mais aussi pour libérer leur potentiel économique. La banque vise également une croissance verte qui passe par une exploitation plus efficace des immenses ressources naturelles du continent africain et la construction d'infrastructures durables. Ces 2 dernières années, 4 millions d'Africains ont bénéficié des projets d'eau et d'assainissement. 10 millions ont bénéficié des projets agriculture, 11 millions ont bénéficié des projets énergie, 19 millions ont bénéficié des projets transport, 49 millions ont bénéficié des projets santé de la banque. La Banque africaine de développement n'est pas seulement une banque, c'est une institution de développement des connaissances qui défend l'Afrique. Une force vitale dans les recherches de sources de financement. La Banque africaine de développement, 50 ans d'existence, 50 ans au service de l'Afrique.
Ladies and gentlemen, what a journey. Please help us really recognize this with putting your hands together with this excellent journey we've witnessed over the past 50 years. Thank you. And actually, may I just ask, please, we have a little bit more silence in the room because it's quite noisy and we can feel it from here. We only have 50 minutes for 51 years, so please cooperate a little bit with us. Thank you very much. Very much appreciated. To get us started this morning, we have with us somebody we call Kantinka. He'll come and deliver the first keynote we have this morning. And I want to call on Kantinka, who is, for us, the third president of the African Development Bank. So, sir, you're welcome.
Madam President, governors, board members, management, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the celebration of 50 years of existence of the African Development Bank is a sacred duty and function. To be asked to take such a significant and meaningful part in it, as I've been invited to do, is tantamount to being requested to perform a biblically sacrosanct divine function. This invitation to be so involved in this sacred year of activities of ADB gives me the consolation that, after all, my influence in the bank was not as negative or as pernicious as events connected with my departure suggested. I now feel vindicated. I feel, after all, I'm appreciated. It may be useful for me to go back to June 1965. That was the time when I was hired to do a summer job with the World Bank. And that was the time when the ADB had been born for about 7 months. And therefore, I had to study the file so as to be able to do a follow-up for my boss, who at the time happened to be Mr. von Hoffman. And therefore, in choosing a topic for my remarks, excuse me, it has been very, very, very difficult, but I'll try. You may recall St. Aquinas in Medio Stat Virtus. And I hope I can succeed in steering between unnecessary negativities and unrealistic positivities. I have elected to talk on the origins and early history of the African Development Bank. In this way, I hope to present facts and their relative importance to this institution of destiny to African progress. I appreciate the president of the bank, the board, the management and staff allowing me to do this. I thank you all for the honor. After these introductory remarks, Mr. Chairman, and I think I'm told there's no chairman, but whoever introduced me can stand in for the chairman. Let me now get on with my contribution to the celebration of the 50 years anniversary of ADB. At the time, the countries of Africa were deeply divided on the fundamental issue of what to do with their newly won independence. There were differences in culture and orientation among them, particularly between the English-speaking and the French-speaking states. Although they were technically independent, many of them still maintained strong links with their former colonial rulers and were partners with them in political, economic, and strategic pacts of cooperation. The differences between the founding states must be appreciated in order to understand the difficulties that the bank has faced. When I was president of the bank, I had to do with difficulties which could only be explained by the differences between the French-speaking and the English-speaking states. The consensus that led to the formation of the bank was hailed at the time as a major achievement. But this consensus was based on a deliberate decision of the leaders to overlook some of the fundamental differences between them. As a result, there was no real agreement on a common management culture for the bank. This was later to have a destructive influence on the management and governance of the bank. The unique setting in which the bank was created is sometimes overlooked by external observers who seem to be mystified by the many unorthodox features of the bank, including the over-politicization of its procedures and decision-making. What these external observers fail to appreciate is that the Africa for which the bank was created consisted of states with different and sometimes conflicting orientations and expectations. With the exception of Ethiopia, Liberia, Egypt, and Libya, all the original members of the bank had been independent for less than a decade before 1963. Moreover, many of them were, at the time, only nominally independent. As we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the bank, we need to remind ourselves of these facts. We should recall the words of Herodotus, the father of history, who said in another context that not to know what happened before you were born is forever to remain a child. In other words, if we wish to predict the future, we need to take account of what happened in the past, as well as what is happening now. We should learn from our past so that we may be able to speak more meaningfully about the future. When the bank was established, there were three main centers of political gravity in Africa, namely the Arab African bloc of states, the influence of France on its former colonies, and the Anglophone bloc of states that had previously been colonies of Britain. Each of these centers of political gravity had a significant influence on the bank and helped to shape its structure, and the terms of association were agreed by its members, which were agreed by its members. The first center of political gravity was the Arab African bloc, consisting of Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, and Sudan. It was the most homogeneous of the blocs, culturally and politically. In spite of their different histories, they shared a common heritage of Arab culture and political thought. The independence of the African colonies in Black Africa was seen by them as an opportunity for the southward expansion of their political influence, and they sought to take advantage of the opportunity by supporting the independence movement, first in the English-speaking countries and later in French colonies. They sought to use the concept of African brotherhood to extract concessions from the Black African states. However, their support for Black Africa could not displace their sympathies and bonds with the Arabs in the Middle East. The concept of African brotherhood was used by the Arab states to persuade the Black African state to accept Mr. Bahire of blessed memory from Sudan as the first president of the bank, although there were, at the time, equally strong candidates from Black Africa. The concept was that the reason for the agreement to replace Mr. Bahire with Mr. Labidi when Mr. Bahire unexpectedly left the post in 1970. Mr. Labidi was not re-elected at the end of his 5-year term, and he was replaced by me as the first non-Arab president. This resulted in a palpable cooling of the Arab support for the bank. During my 35 months as president, I encountered much hostility from several of the Arab states, and the beginning of my tenure was marked by a mass exodus of senior Arab officials from the bank. Those who remained showed clearly that they were uncomfortable in the new environment. In a letter from a former senior Arab official addressed to another, urging him also to leave, the writer noted that since the Africans had denied a second term of office to Mr. Labidi, the bank could not expect to receive any more funds from the Arab states. At this time, the bank was in dire need of funds, and there was the expectation that funding would come from the oil-rich Arab states. But it soon emerged that the expectation was based on rather naive assumption. Although the Arab states continued to provide funds for the development of Africa, they channeled their contributions through their own national institutions, and only a small part of the contributions was actually disbursed by the bank. There was thus some truth in the prediction that the Arab states would not support the bank in the same extent that they had done in the years when they held the presidency. The second major center of political gravity was a strong influence that France wielded on the African states that had previously been their French colonies. There is now ample evidence to show that a major canon of French policy towards Africa at the time was to frustrate attempts to establish cohesive ties among the African states. The original conception of General de Gaulle was to create a French community, Communauté Française, that would embrace all the overseas territories of France, but it soon became clear that there was not much support among the African states for such a community. In a book published in 1995 by Mr. Jacques Foucault, one of the principal architects of the African policy of General de Gaulle, has exposed the real motive behind this policy. This book contains chilling revelations and confessions which leave no doubt at all about what General de Gaulle had in mind for the African states. General de Gaulle was concerned about the movement in parts of Africa, advocating complete independence of African states from Europe, particularly by Nasser and Nkrumah of the Casablanca group. The opposing group, the Monrovia group, was not considered sufficiently effective challenge. It was seen as too heterogeneous, with nothing to cement its member countries together. As it could not be relied upon to advance the interests of France, General de Gaulle also mistrusted the English-speaking countries in Africa, and he was against any association between them and the former French colonies. He feared that the French-speaking countries would in the end be swallowed up by the English-speaking countries. The pervasive influence of France on its former colonies had a great impact and affected the attitude of these countries, especially with regard to the language to be used in the bank. The charter of the bank had been adopted in English and French, and it was agreed that English and French would be its working language. This in itself should not have created much difficulty. Many such multinational institutions had operated without difficulties in the past. However, the French-speaking staff members refused to operate in English, even though the bulk of international financial transactions are conducted in this language. This created an uneasy atmosphere in the bank. Today, however, I'm pleased to say that the general feeling is that the Francophone members of staff now make far greater effort to speak and write in English than the Anglophone counterparts. The Anglophone states form the third center of political gravity. Most of them had previously been colonies of Britain, and many of them were members of Casablanca Group. Their leaders generally shared a common culture and tended to think along the same lines. They also tended to be more independent in their relationship with Britain and other European countries than their French-speaking counterparts. However, the main confrontation in the bank was more between the two antagonistic members of Casablanca and Monrovia groups, and less between the English-speaking and French-speaking countries, although the conflict between the two language groups caused problems of its own. And now we come to the birth of the African Development Bank. The establishment of the bank was made possible by the support of all three main centers of political gravity about which I've just finished speaking. The Arab states believed that support for the bank would secure the sympathy and support of the black states for their geopolitical battles in the Middle East. The Monrovia group were happy that the bank, since it recognized their sovereignty and independence and rejected the radical idea of unified continental state to which they were vehemently opposed, it was only obvious that they would be happy with the turn of events. The Casablanca group saw the bank as a means to bring the African states together, although it was not based on the United Continental Government that they exposed. All three groups found it convenient to rally around the concept of African solidarity as a magnetic force. It was, of course, recognized that the ADB will require monetary contributions from its members, for it needed to generate resources in order to advance the economic and social progress of its members, individually and collectively, as required by its charter, had to be taken into account. At the time, the member states did not have a common historical legacy, nor did they share the same objective. Indeed, the different groups among them had different ambitions. The Casablanca group wanted a United States of Africa with a shared economy and a central bank. The members of the Monrovia group, on the other hand, were only prepared to accept an association between separate and independent states. The ADB was modeled on the Inter-American Development Bank, which had been created a few years before. The General Counsel of the Inter-American Bank, Mr. Arnold Weiss, was assigned to advise and assist the technicians of the ECA in preparing the draft instruments for the bank. On the issue of the role of non-African states in the bank, there was a predictable difference of opinion. The majority of the states took the radical nationalistic position and opposed any participation of non-African states in the bank. They considered that the bank was an expression of Africa's independence from its colonial past, and allowing non-Africans to participate in it will be an admission that Africa was unable to manage its own affairs. They were thus opposed to any foreign participation in the bank, regardless of whatever advantages that might bring. Other states were in favor of opening the bank to non-regional states. They argued that this would increase the funds of the bank and enable it to broaden the scope of its operations. They pointed out that non-regional states were participating in the Inter-American Development Bank and Asian Development Bank, and they noted that this had helped these banks to mobilize more resources and improve their effectiveness. In the end, the economic realities prevailed, and the bank was finally opened to participation by non-regional states in 1978. The bank is now a financially strong institution with an increased capital base of $100 billion compared to its $200 million in 1979. Currently, it is the only AAA-rated entity in Africa, and it has a very strong presence in the global capital markets, and it has become a strong voice and a convening force for Africa. It is now able to provide development assistance of $8 billion a year to African countries compared to $500 million that it could provide in 1979. Ladies and gentlemen, on the continent itself, there has been a progress in the advance of democracy and in the growth and restoration of macroeconomic stability for more than 2 decades. However, challenges still remain. Half of the people in sub-Saharan Africa live on less than $1 a day, and AIDS continues to threaten the social fabric of the continent. Studies conducted by various organizations, including the African Development Bank and the World Bank show that, with the exception of Northern and Southern Africa, the United Nations Millennium Development Goals of reducing by half the number of persons living in poverty and without access to potable water by 2015 will, in most cases, not be attained. Nevertheless, these same studies indicate that the majority of African countries have the potential to make significant progress towards these goals. The improved economic results since the end of the 1990s, the over 5% growth rates registered across the continent over the last decade, and the restoration of peace in many parts of the continent confirm this possibility. To keep these hopes alive, a three-level effort, as suggested in the studies referred to above, is needed. Donor countries should be encouraged to increase official development assistance in line with their commitments. Beneficiary states should be urged to pursue and deepen the economic reform, and private foreign investors must be induced to integrate into the continent their industrial, commercial, and financial strategies. The ADB Group should, for its part, persist in its founding mission of helping development efforts on the continent. In the light of the above, ladies and gentlemen, what should be the future course of the African Development Bank, taking into account the lessons of history and the opportunities offered by today's realities, such as improved border communication, the power of social media to galvanize African youth around common causes, to finally shake off the last vestiges of our divisive past. Let me conclude. From the history of the bank, the institution was established to finance investment projects and programs which promote the economic and social development of members, giving special priority to those which concern several members, render the economies increasingly complementary, and bring about an ordinary expansion in their foreign trade. Africa has a number of unique growth-retarding constraints, including the continent's fragmentation into many small domestic markets, coupled with landlocked national economies, often with insufficient access to major markets. These were some of the reasons that forced the earlier African leaders to opt for the establishment of the bank. This is one area that the bank has not been able to show what it has achieved over the years. The 10-year strategy of the bank, recently announced, hopes to correct and reinforce the financing of regional projects. We can only keep an eye on the promise. In addition to volume increase, there is a need to mention that donors need to open up to more innovative use of their donor-provided funds to help bring additional resources from the private sectors. It is widely known that the American market is saturated, and while Europe cannot get moving and the Chinese are in need of resources, the African continent is the second fastest growing at an average rate of 5%. The recent U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in Washington, for the first time, allowed the largest, I beg your pardon, to lock down beneficial terms of trade. The aim of the summit was to help U.S. companies gain traction on the continent that holds enough for us. I think because of what Honorable Mo just said, I can skip this part of my talk and just refer to what he said at the summit, that the Americans and the Europeans should follow the example of the Chinese so that we might be able to benefit from them as well. But I'd like to emphasize one thing which came out of the summit. Private equity investment has found opportunities in the continent, and with their participation on the investment committees and the respective boards of these companies, this format could enhance investments in Africa. One of the most important facets of private equity is deal flow. With its offices across the continent, the ADB has access to numerous deal flows. Secondly, with its inherent understanding of the economies and politics of the very countries of the continent, ADB has the ability to package these deals to the acceptance of these funders. An African investment private equity fund, spearheaded by ADB, with seed capital from ADB itself and multiple funds from the private sector, managed by ADB, investing in 3 named sectors, would enhance the continent immensely. It is the hope and belief that the bank will be able successfully in the future, as it has been the past 50 years. Let us therefore, with one accord, congratulate the bank and wish it many happy and joyful anniversaries. May the African Development Bank enjoy yet more successes in the next 50 years. And to this I say, ad multos annos, gloria tibi annos, vivat, vivat, vivat. Thank you very much. I'll take it. May I have your permission to welcome President Alassane Ouattara? I've just been, a note was passed to me, and I think it's only fair that I go to his section and shake his hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kantinka, for this very rich testimony. We had 50 minutes for 50 years, 51 years. So now we're going to turn to Her Excellency Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, President of the Republic of Liberia, for her keynote remarks. Madam President.
Excellencies, heads of state, Board of Governors, Mr. President and former presidents, officers and staff of the African Development Bank, distinguished guests and participants, ladies and gentlemen. I stand today proud of the role Liberia played in the establishment of the African Development Bank. A role of shuttle diplomacy by Dr. Romeo Horton, a Liberian, in bringing together the Casablanca and Monrovia groups the architects on the establishment of the Organization of African Unity to move Africa economically and politically. The role of Liberia as a member of the Committee of Nine to start the work on the bank's charter. A role as a member of those who convinced President Houphouët-Boigny to accept the establishment of the headquarters of the bank in Abidjan, and in compromise General Abdou to name the first president of the bank. I recall, as one who attended my first annual meeting in 1972, yes, 1972, as a junior official in the Ministry of Finance, the long hours spent at that and subsequent meetings, debating passionately and sometimes angrily on opening the bank's capital to non-regionals. For some, the bank required more capital than the $200 million then subscribed. For others, they sought to protect what was considered the African character of the bank. Today, with a capital of over $100 billion, we made the right decision to open the capital. Today at 50, our institution has stood the test of time and has truly earned its reputation as a premier development finance institution on the African continent. Our bank represents many things and has done many good things to promote development all over the continent. I must extol some of those achievements. The bank has brought together African professionals of the highest caliber. They work in a multicultural environment with an African accent and within the supreme interests of Africa. The bank allows for creative thinking. That is why, over the years, it has initiated and fostered the development institutions critical to economic development for the region. Several such examples stand out. They have established regional institutions such as Shelter Afrique, Africa Reinsurance, African Exim Bank, and the African Legal Support Facility. The bank has been innovative and progressive in new endeavors, among others, the Fragile State Facility and the Infrastructure Consortium for Africa. It developed a private sector window in practical support of the belief that the private sector is the catalyst for development. The bank staff has consistently been called to important national duties, including those in the political, economic, and financial fields. The bank collaborates with other development finance institutions and with donors and partners, bringing important additionality in financial and technical assistance to its operations. We commend the manner in which the bank conducts elections, as you will do this week, that allows even the smallest regional member countries to be heard and to rise as head of the institution. The bank continues to maintain high marks in the capital markets and is thus able to mobilize capital. And to you, the staff of the bank, the spirit which you bring to your work make a difference and change African lives for the better. Permit me to get a bit personal. To you, President Donald Kaberuka, as you leave the institution, we owe a debt of gratitude for the dynamism, efficiency, and commitment which you brought to the task. Building upon the effort of former presidents, some of them in this room, you have encouraged our effort to tackle the long-standing structural deficiencies in our economies, to emphasize infrastructure as a means of expanding, diversifying, and promoting regional cooperation and integration. You have supported the development of our young population through programs of skills training and employment. You stood by Liberia in visits and in financial and technical support during our most difficult days of the fight against the Ebola virus. Mr. President, you may recall when I visited with you and the deputies in Tunis in 2012 to discuss the fragile state facility, I was asked, why should the African Development Bank be the one to champion this initiative? My answer was simple. We trust you. Mr. President, in building trust and confidence in our institution, in inspiring us to pursue our national and continental vision, in giving our young generation hope in the future, I salute you and all the presidents, former presidents, and staff of the African Development Bank for 50 years of success. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Her Excellency, for this very heartwarming testimony on the bank and its people. We now are going to engage our panel. With us on the panel this morning, we have a former president of the bank, Dr. Babacar Ndiaye, who is with us. We also have the Honorable Minister from Zambia. We have a former minister from South Africa, Honorable Trevor Manuel, and we also have a former executive director from Japan. I'll start with you, Mr. President Ndiaye, and just we've heard a lot, obviously, about the history of the bank, about where the bank is now. On your own words, would you share with us your experience at the bank on this journey, but also where are we headed? Thank you.
Mr. Moderator, I would like to greet everyone here. First of all, Madame Sirleaf Johnson, the President of Liberia, and she was shy not to say what she has done for the bank, and for me personally when she was at the UNDP. But on a general ground, I will say we are proud of you, Madame. Thank you very much. I have the privilege to be with my former president of the DB, Well, when he narrates about the cultural differences, Anglophone, saxophone, and things like that, I remember after 18 months, I was appointed as Deputy Director for Finance. So that exceeds the 6 months probation period. He had one vice president in charge of administration who came to him and said, well, Mr. President, you have exceeded the time. Either you confirm him or, well, you do something else. He has written his book. He has written in this book. But his confusion was that here is a Francophone who has a pretension to be finance manager. Well, he's a Francophone, so for him that was an exception. But at the end of the day, yes, thanks to him, I had this position of Director of Finance. Well, I will say his commitment for the opening of the bank is very important. When he came in, he told us, well, young people and a number of staff, not more than 10, gentlemen, this is my option. Those who are not in agreement, they better resign now, because this is the way I'm going at it. Well, we want to maintain our job, and we follow him. But it's very important to say that Mamoun Beheri, late Mamoun Beheri, late Labidi, late Mungomba, I will say, my illustrious predecessor, it's Beheri who recruited me in the bank. But he was in the spirit, in the mind of the initiator of the African Development Bank once we have decided that it will be the arm for economic independence as AU is the arm for political independence. So on that ground, he considered that the bank has to be the instrument of development set up by African to be managed by the African. So he had that. But I must say, the president has reminded of the Committee of 9. Those people went very well in depth in thinking of the bylaws of the bank, the modus operandi of the bank. They provide in this fantastic provision of special funds to be created. They did consider also that the bank cannot have the kind of IFC. So the bank will be entitled to operate in private sector way back in the Committee of 9. So there are very foresight people, group of experts, African, who thought of that. So what's happened in the kind of Mamoun Beheri? The African Development Fund, which is today one of the stronger financial arms of the bank group, was set up by Mamoun Beheri, was his initiatives. And it was completed at the end of the process by Labidi, who came after him. And so this is a legacy of Mamoun Beheri. But the deepest legacy he had on us, really, Mr. President, I'm sorry to say that, it had nothing to do with Arab, with Anglophone, with saxophone, whoever. Mamoun Beheri gave us the love for Africa, to give us the sentiment that even the driver should be committed to service this continent, because we are an exceptional group of people that paid by Africa, and we are the pioneer. So the love of Africa, that was our most motivation. My first meeting with Beheri, he told me, Babakar, you listen, young man, you have done all these studies in France, etc., etc. I hate the expression of technical assistant that he was telling me. What do you mean by technical assistance? Those who have studied with you in France, when they come to Abidjan at the place, they say they are teaching you a technical assistant. So you have to work hard, quickly, in order that will reverse the situation. That the African is not Africanization, no. Indigenization, no. But we have to have competent African to take over. That was Mamoun Beheri. So I must say, you allow me, because I have stayed 30 years in the bank. Let me say that 30 years is corresponding to the first 30 years of the institution. I have been a staff member before becoming what I am known for, to be the president of the bank. But that period of a staff member, I have to think of some of my staff people, my colleagues who were there, who really was working hard with abnegation, devotion, in order to make this bank achieve what was said. So that was very important. Then when I come to become president of the bank, that is another story. It can be read from the proceeding of the institution. One thing I say. One thing is important. When I became president of the bank, I have these legacies to handle. But I have a commitment to make a difference. One of the things was that I wanted this bank to be comparable for all intents and purposes with the statistic being carefully studied, to be comparable to the World Bank. I would shoot her high, to be comparable with the World Bank. At the end of the day, when the studies were made, I was bold enough to say that we have every ratio in our favor. But, Madam President, allow me to say this, because it's written in my book, Foi de Banquier. The bank, African Development Bank, has to prove, like women in main societies, that she is performing more or better than the men in order to be recognized once. Our bank, at that time, was performing so well that there was no way but to accept that we are top at the level of every multinational development bank.
Thank you very much, Mr.
The big story about the AAA. No. We have to put facts clear. The book fair of AAA. I engineered it from 1978. And in 1994, it's not the bank as such, but the mastermind of the AAA was the Vice President of Finance, honored that Mr. Mungomba gave it to me. I handled it, and at the end, by December 1984, I was recognized as the banker for the year, because we had AAA from Fitch, AAA from Moody's, and AA plus for the Standard & Poor's. So that is top investment grade. Even today, there is no African countries who have the AA. We have to say that. Secondly, when later on, 20 years after, or 10 years, whatever, they've been in 1996, I was no longer in the bank, but I knew that we were on the watch position from Standard & Poor's, that we may be downgraded if we don't have the capital increase, downgrade to be AAA Standard & Poor's, and to become AA plus. For those who are practitioners of the market, who know the market, who knows what investment grade means, and today I'm very happy to say so, because, Madam Chairman, all the people who are here today, our new ministers and leaders of the institution, they know the meaning of top investment grade. So it was wrong to build the reputation saying that ADB has lost its AAA status. No. We had a split rating, and that split rating today is among the top. Kaberuka has this fantastic thing he did. Yes, but on what you have said about him, I will say that I am a bit African, deeply African on that. I have given my shoulder to someone to sit and look afar. Kaberuka has just done that. He has done that. I tripled the capital of the bank by my work from 6 billion to 30 billion. That's before I left the bank. He came and from about 40 to 100 billion. That he has been the man who is the loudspeaker, the voice of Africa in the international fora with the head of state in the world. I've been the speaker for the capital market. I introduced the bank in the capital market. That was my main job. But what he has done, the French will say, I'll stop on that. Il a mené la banque dans la cour des grands. Dans la cour des grands, et cette cour des grands, il a mené au niveau des chefs d'État, et il a même convaincu l'Afrique que la banque était un instrument important pour cette institution. Alors, ce que je voudrais dire, mesdames et messieurs, un seul conseil. Il ne serait pas souhaitable que quelqu'un qui vient après Kaberuka essaye de bâtir sa réputation, n'est-ce pas, en prenant le bilan est fait d'actifs et de passifs. Essayez de voir ce qu'il y a dans le passif de Kaberuka et d'essayer de bâtir sa réputation sur ça. Moi, je suis un comptable. Je suis un comptable de formation, expert comptable, tout ce que vous voulez. Mais surtout, un homme de grande sensibilité. Je regarde le résultat net. Monsieur Kaberuka, votre résultat net est fantastique. L'Afrique vous doit des fières chandelles. C'est ce que je voulais dire. Vous m'excuserez d'avoir été long, mais c'était important que je dise cela. Je souhaite simplement que celui qui viendra sache que l'Afrique considérera que c'est un péché, qu'il essaie de bâtir sa réputation sur ce que peut être des faiblesses de Kaberuka. C'est normal quand quelqu'un vient qu'il repense, qu'il fasse même des réformes. Ça, c'est tout à fait normal. Mais on n'essaye pas de casser quelqu'un qui a fait un si beau travail. Que Dieu vous bénisse et merci de nous écouter.
You know, I love this kind of unscripted and uncensored discussion among really Africans. This is absolutely great. Trevor Manuel, Honorable Trevor Manuel, you've been Minister of Finance, you've now in the private sector. You know, we would want to hear from you. This same kind of totally unscripted and uncensored testimony you can have on the bank, looking at the 50 years, but also, you know, give us some perspective on where the bank should be also heading. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Babakar, Madam President, other heads of state and government present, former president and current president of the African Development Bank. Thank you very much, Babakar. For me to speak here after the previous three speakers, I'm just reminded that I'm a babe in the hoods. I'm a second-half player. My association is only about 24 years. When then President Babakar Ndiaye invited still an unfree South Africa to come in and participate as an African state in the work of the ADB, and Madiba had asked me to come along and begin this association. And during these 25 years, we've seen this bank grow from strength to strength. Clearly, if one looks around the continent, amongst the issues that are now supporting us are the three Pan-African institutions and the way in which they assist us. The African Development Bank, the UNECA, and the African Union. It's very important that we use these three pillars of Pan-Africanism to strengthen every aspect of our governance on the continent. On the periphery of this conference, we will encounter this community of practice, and these are the unsung stories that unfold in respect of battles on gender and health and education, provision of services, and what the big ADB initiatives of the more recent period, such as PIDA, present for us in the current and the future. These are our big strengths, and I think it's for this reason that we must continue to mobilize together, because part of what we're dealing with is a development paradigm in the world that still doesn't favor those who need to play catch-up like all of us on the African continent. We need a strong, resonant voice with very clear ideas that can shift. We know that the past 50 years has not seen linear development on the continent. Part of it is that the African Development Bank mirrors what happens in states. And for a long period in these past 50 years, the fact that structural adjustment had prevented countries from thinking beyond the tight scripted confines of SAPS meant that the African Development Bank merely had to mirror that. Right now, we have a better opportunity for an institution learning from its own past to be a catalyst into the future. And I think that's what PIDA and all of this community of practice represents to us, so that we can shift the discourse to deal with issues like climate change, like the demographic dividend that we can yield, and like the fact that the world needs food and Africa has land, but there's an ongoing battle. We need to unite and we need the resonant voice. And I think that as we've seen over the period, increasingly certainly under the leadership of President Kaberuka, we are now in a pivotal position to advance this discussion in the global economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Manuel. Thank you very much, Honorable Manuel. So consolidate, the assets, and at the same time, look at the future and engage in the discussions of the days, too. I now want to turn to Mr. Kiyoshi Kodera, who is the former executive director from Japan, a non-regional member country. So, Mr. Kodera, would you share with us your experience when you were in the bank, seen from Japan? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so proud that my engagement with this bank is longer than Trevor. 35 years ago, as a junior bureaucrat from Ministry of Finance in Japan, I landed the Abidjan airport. And I served for this institution as an ADF director for 2 years. So, je suis très heureux de revenir à Abidjan. Those were the days when Japan committed hugely for this ADF. There was an ADF 2 negotiation, and 1/3 of the funding gap we took up. So by the time I came here, Japan was a #1 contributor to the ADF. I did the ADF 3 and also the accession work to the admission work to the ADB. Those were the very quiet day, but the bank was quite healthy in focusing on infrastructure and agriculture. Now I left the bank and moved to Washington. But during the 80s, Babacar did a great job, get the AAA the status, and he launched the Samurai Bond program in Japan. And Japan considered to be probably one of the largest the funds provider to this institution. By the middle of the last decade, 2004-05, 1/3 of the borrowing for this bank was made in yen. And so behind the capital increase, we also contribute from the Japanese capital market, typical Mrs. Watanabe. So these are the history. But I also engaged with this bank in a different the position. First, I came back as an ADF deputy in the Ministry of Finance from 2001 to 2005. And those were the days of talking about debt reduction, HIPICS, and the MDRI. And frankly speaking, Japan was not a big fan of those movements. We always believed in new money. So the ADF 9 and 10 negotiation was a little bit tough for me. But at the end of the road, before the Gleneagles Summit, we decided the Africa really moved to go for the private sector. So is the ADB. So we launched a major program called Enhanced Private Sector Assistance, and which is called EPSA. And those days we committed 1 billion in 2005. That program has been enhanced further in 2012 to 1 billion. And the year after, the 2 years ago, when the Prime Minister Abe visited this country, we have increased that additional 1 billion commitment to 2 billion. So we will really count on the new bank's structure for the private sector development. And another unspoken history, latter half of the last decade, I moved to Washington to become an executive secretary for the development committee. I didn't overlap with Trevor, but I had a secret plan. I owe this bank so much. I got lots of experience from here in Abidjan. And so what I should return to this bank? I should give Kaberuka permanent seat in the main table of the development committee. That's what happened in 2006. So this tradition is still there. And also, I got involved with the voice and participation reform in the World Bank Group. And during my stay in the World Bank, the African chair has been increased from 2 to 3. And so more voices needed. As of now, the JICA is working very closely with the African Development Bank. We have a very tight, the large co-financing and also non-sovereign assistance. And we are 110 billion huge institution. But still, I have to say, our commitment to Sub-Saharan Africa is, until 2 years ago, less than 1 billion. But we will continue to focus on this continent, and together, the African Development Bank is our core sort of the development partner in pushing forward our way. Finally, the challenge for this continent is job creation. And the job creation is not the single sort of the issue. It's a very complex issue. Infrastructure is needed, financing is needed. So the institution like bank, which can conduct whole of the government approach, is quite important, particularly with the very regional flavor. Yesterday we talked about the health with the President Johnson Sirleaf, and health is important, but in order to achieve the health goal, we have to have a power, we have to have a feeder road, we have to have a water. So the multi-facet approach is continue to be important, and stimulus to the private sector. So I really wish you the next wonderful 50 years for this bank. And thank you very much for the management and President Kaberuka for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kodera, for the commitment and also for really, playing the role you've been playing as a non-regional member state, in strengthening our African bank. I would like now to turn to Honorable Chikwanda from Zambia. Honorable, you've heard the history of the bank. You've heard from the non-regional member state, and you have heard from both the challenges then and what seems to be the challenges of the bank ahead. As a sitting Minister of Finance, how do you see the bank, and what do you really see as the bank's biggest contribution in your country, to be specific?
Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, as we all know, Zambia is more or less the epicenter of Pan-Africanism. So we have always been supportive, unequivocally supportive of all the Pan-African institutions created to take the continent forward. Former Presidents Babaka Njai and Kwame Fodio, my friend, will confirm Zambia supported their presidents. With regard to Kwame Fodio, I had a little delicate task because I was governor of the bank that time when he became president, a little delicate task of persuading Nigeria to support the Ghanaian candidate. And I think I was lucky in that task because the then president was, Shagari was like my elder brother. So we've always used whatever little clout influence we have on the African continent to support the African institutions. Now, the African Development Bank is one of the glaring success stories on the African continent, which doesn't have a glut of success stories. So we need to support it as an institution for fostering development in our countries, on the continent, and elsewhere in the world. We have many ideas of development, but these ideas very often lack delivery vehicles. To deliver the ideas, to bring the ideas to fruition, we need institutions, and the African Development Bank is one such institution. And I must say that those who have led the African institutions have not only had the commitment, but also the vision. And the current president, John Kaberuka, is the most ideal embodiment of that vision and that commitment to take African development forward. And it's our hope and expectation that the person who succeeds, Don Kaberuka, will embody the irrevocable commitment of Don and also the vision for Africa. My advice to the bank is that, as an institution for development in Africa, it must also, within our countries on the continent, support institutions that give that are an anchor for development. For instance, as the Japanese colleague has said, job creation is an important facet of our development. But we need institutions that foster job creation, and the development banks within the African continent, in the various countries, various small institutions that lend resources to the small, medium enterprise, they will need support from the African Development Bank. So I can only say wish the bank all the success, and the incoming president, every bit of success. We all have a duty to support the new president. And while we lavish accolades on the management of the bank, we should also constantly remind the bank of the need to reform, to carry out reforms which have the effect of accelerating the development processes in our countries and on the continent. Thank you very much.
Indeed do what we need, which is accelerating the development process on our continent. And of course, as we all know, in 2 days, big days also on the election of the new president of the bank. We're now getting at the end of this panel, but before we turn over to the next panel, which will be starting, and please, you all would remain seated so that we can change this panel, and the head of state would come onto the next session. I would want to go back to Her Excellency, President of Liberia. Madam President, as you reminded us, you had a long and rich engagement with this bank, and we have heard you talk about the achievements. We have heard you talk about also not only of the bank, but the people of the bank, the Africans, non-Africans working in the bank. And as a word of conclusion, Madam President, I just would want to hear from you, what advice would you give the bank now and the incoming leadership towards where we'd be heading? Because of course we heard about what President Jai said. We heard what the minister from Zambia has said. What would be your final word for us looking back and then looking at the future? Thank you.
We hope that the bank will support what I believe to be a common vision, a harmonized development agenda of the transformation of Africa. And that truly means continuing the effort in infrastructure to promote regional cooperation and integration, to improve interconnectivity among our countries, to ensure that the goals of transformation established by the African Development Bank in its Vision 2063, which emphasizes those things: infrastructure, agriculture, concentration on the young population of Africa, for those are the real ones that will carry on the work. And today, their lack of skills and employment represents a real threat to us achieving our goals. I believe that we can count on the bank to build upon the success they already have, the achievements already made, toward the achievement of those goals. And I hope also that we'll see the bank support more women leadership around the continent.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for those words of wisdom and really for encouraging everybody to pull forward with a common vision to finally transform our continent. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. This was the opening plenary for the 2015 annual meetings. We are requested to stay seated. We are going to continue with our morning sessions with the next presidential panel. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, panel.
En 2014, la BAD retourne en Côte d'Ivoire. Elle retrouve ainsi le pays qui l'a vu naître en 1964 et 1965. Les relations entre l'institution et son pays d'accueil ont toujours été fortes. Entre 1970 et 2014, la banque a financé 70 opérations d'une valeur de plus de 2 milliards de dollars. Le transport, l'énergie, l'eau et l'assainissement, mais aussi les télécommunications et l'agriculture ont été ses priorités de développement. Les infrastructures représentent près de la moitié des aides BAD. 5 opérations sont en cours en Côte d'Ivoire pour une valeur de 174 millions de dollars.
L'essentiel concerne vraiment les infrastructures qui, le montant d'à peu près 2 milliards de dollars, on va dire qu'au moins...